Life during the Great Depression. As we move through the slides, you'll see the vocabulary is highlighted in red, the main ideas are in blue, and the cause and effect is in white. Life in the city was really hard during the Great Depression. Many people lost their jobs, and when that happened, they could no longer pay their mortgage or rent, so evictions were very common. People were often being removed from their homes with all their belongings lost or on the street. Many slept in sewers, parks, anywhere they could find some kind of shelter and some sense of security. Many used newspapers as blankets. They built shanties, which are shacks, out of whatever materials they could find, cardboard boxes, crates from food, pieces of metal, whatever they could fabricate into a home-like structure. Obviously, these things did not keep people warm or out of the rain and snow. There was little to no sanitation. There's a picture of an outhouse that's floating on top of a river. There was little access to clean drinking water. These shanty towns popped up all over the country, obviously causing diseases and viruses to spread quickly. People could not afford food. They begged or they rummaged through the garbage. Anything they could find to eat, they didn't care if it was rotten or no good. They created new recipes with simple ingredients. Other manufacturers created goods that were more affordable. However, they were compromised in their integrity. So the ingredients weren't always the best or the safest. Many organizations set up soup kitchens and bread lines. Soup was easy and cheap to serve to large amounts of people, and a little bit could go a long way. And bread was easy to bake in large quantities. A typical diet during this time comprised of dry beans, potatoes, and powdered milk, things that didn't go bad easily and that could give them enough energy to get through the day. Nativism remained and racial tensions increased, so the belief that natives to America were superior and deserved jobs and opportunities before immigrant or minority groups. The unemployed whites blamed African Americans and Latinos for the loss of their jobs. These groups experienced extreme hardships. Unemployment rate in African Americans was 50% of the almost 25%. They were often paid less than white workers. In the southwestern United States, states like Texas and New Mexico, Mexican Americans became targets. Some whites wanted them deported even if they were born in the US. So to deport someone just means that you are sending them to another place. By the late 1930s, hundreds of thousands of people with Mexican descent moved to Mexico. Some went on their own will, some were deported by the US government. Life in rural areas. Remember, rural means country or outside the city. Many of them also lost their homes, as we had seen previously. Farmers lost their farms because prices of crops fell and they couldn't pay their debts. We reviewed this when we went over the causes of the Great Depression. There are many foreclosures, but moving to cities really didn't help them very much. Many farmers at least could grow their own food to provide for their families for the time being. Some turned to sharecropping, which we discussed after the Civil War, which is the idea where you borrow land and or money or goods for supplies to farm, and you repay the landowner. This was not concentrated to just one area. All across the United States, we saw shanty towns, we saw sharecropping, we saw homelessness. It was not restricted restricted to one demographic, one location. All right, so the Dust Bowl. In early 1900s, farmers plowed the Great Plains. Things were going fairly well. This is before World War I, and people were using the land. They were taking advantage of all the open space and the cheap land available with government incentives to develop this land and farm to supply food to the cities. However, as they do this, they're removing that beautiful grass, those grains of gold, and that allowed for the soil to start to break down. Once they continue to plant there without replenishing the nutrients that's needed in the soil, it started to break down the soil into finer dust. The climate of the Great Plains is semi-arid. There's not a lot of rainfall every year. As we also know, there are a lot of tornadoes. So if you have loose soil, when a tornado comes through, that could be pretty devastating. The roots of the grass being gone allowed for erosion to happen, or where wind and water is able to cut into the earth. Farmland became unsuitable for farming. The soil was dry, there was no nutrients, there was no trees, so a dust bowl was created. This happened to also be the worst drought. Like we mentioned, the grass. So the Dust Bowl region is considered Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and New Mexico. Oklahoma and Kansas City were some of the hardest hit regions. They had a series of droughts, which is the lack of rain, so the soil was able to just blow around and there was nothing to hold in place. This created the Great Migration, which we also talked about during the stock market crash and the causes of the Great Depression. So when all that happened, the Dust Bowl was going on at the same time. So it was the convergence of all these things happening at one time. Frequent dust storms made it unsuitable. They were being evicted from their homes. 2.5 million people left that region. Many went to California or the other Pacific Coast states like Oregon and Washington. However, they were not wanted there. Those people were also struggling from an economic depression. Those people were also out of jobs, so they didn't want more people who were in need, more mouths to feed, more people to have to try to provide jobs for. So they were not welcome. They actually created billboards that stated that on your way to these states. Most of them, when they got to these cities, just joined in with the homelessness in the shanty towns that were in these areas because they were not able to find jobs. So the farmers who stayed, their crops died because of lack of rain. Their livestock, so horses, cows, goats, choked to death because of the dust storms. The air quality was really, really bad, which had horrible effects on animals and people. Some of the dust clouds were over a mile high and could darken out the sky, sometimes for days. So you could go 5 days without ever seeing a blue sky, without ever seeing the sun, just living in this cloud. They called them black blizzards. And there was one that moved all the way to New York City. On the video clips that I provided this week, it actually shows real footage that has been regenerated into color that you can see from New York Harbor on a Navy ship, this giant cloud of dust moving across New York City. These are some images of what it would look like. Can you imagine you are driving down the road or you are standing on your front porch and this is coming at you? So yes, you can run inside and hide. However, that wasn't always safe. The dust would build up like snow builds up. You'd have to dig your way out, which sand is very, very heavy. And your home would often be filled with this dust because it was so fine. It would get into cracks under doors, between wood planks. It would cover your food, your furniture, your clothes. There is also a thing called dust pneumonia or brown plague. So just like the animals would die because of inhalation of the dust, so did humans. All right, so by 1934, so a year later, 35 million acres were useless, and another 125 million acres were quickly losing their topsoil. So like I mentioned, dust was reaching all the way to the East Coast. In 1935 to 1937, the federal government tried to prevent soil erosion, natural wearing of the land, in Nebraska by planting trees, building dams, ponds, and terraces. So this idea was double-fold. One, it was providing jobs. It was putting money into the economy because the government was buying the goods and materials for these projects, and it was hopefully going to help with the Dust Bowl problem. The effects from that lasted to 1950. All right, so you have people living in shanty towns, you have people who are unemployed, you have people who are fleeing their homes because of the dust storms. It is a bad situation in many different areas. So, of course, there was mental difficulties. Men were struggling with not being able to care for their families. At this time, that was the man's responsibility. And if you could not do that, you were looked down upon. You felt like you had failed as a husband and as a father. The federal government did not offer much help. Some cities and charities did try to help, but they often struggled. Many men would just wander the streets looking for work. Many abandoned their families and became hobos. They would use boxcars and they would sleep under bridges, traveling from town to town. About 300,000 hobos estimated were around during the Depression, traveling from place to place. Women during this time, many canned food and sewed clothing to try to save money. If they worked outside of the home, they made less than men. If you were a married woman, often you were denied jobs because they felt you were taking away from men that needed employment. Some businesses and schools wouldn't hire a married woman. These are two of the most famous photos from the Great Depression's photograph of a mother apparently sitting, wondering, how is she going to survive? How are we going to get through this with her small children? This is one of the most famous photographs associated with the Great Depression. All right, so kids, can you imagine being a kid at this time? You're starving, you don't really understand what's going on, you don't have a home, there's no toys, you might maybe go to school, you might not. There was no health care. They had poor diets because there wasn't much food. Sickness and illness, especially if you're living in places that don't provide those things for you. Rickets still is a common problem, and that's the lack of vitamin D, which we all know is important for building strong bones. So that created a lot of problems with growth and development in children that would affect them all through their lives. Many schools were often closed down as well. Some teenagers, mostly boys, ran away from home, either to get away from the stress and the struggle or to alleviate that stress and struggle on their family, figuring if they went out independently, they wouldn't have to burden their mothers and their fathers, and maybe they could find work. They rode in boxcars across the country. It was very dangerous. They often were involved in illegal activities and violence. Almost 25,000 were killed and or injured, and 27,000 injured over the course of 10 years, and that is an estimate. Entertainment. All right, many families often played board games or listened to the radio. 40% of Americans had a radio at this time. We see the growth of board games like Monopoly and Sorry. There were radio shows through various times of the day. Sports like the New York Yankees and college football were very popular. Contests like dancing. 40% of Americans watched at least one movie per week. There was an increase in movies about crime, so gangs, bootlegging, that sort of thing. So in 1934, they made new restrictions on movies, which would eventually become our movie ratings, like PG, PG-13. Some of the more popular movies that are still popular today: Frankenstein, The Wizard of Oz, King Kong, and Gone with the Wind. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and Scarface. This is a picture of Walt Disney. During the 1930s is when he developed Disney World. All right, some more psychological effects. So people were demoralized. They lost the will to live. The suicide rate increased dramatically. They're starving. They can't take care of themselves. They can't take care of their families. Alcoholism increased. With that, we have the end of prohibition, or the ban on the production and sale of alcohol that we talked about in the 18th Amendment. We now have the 21st Amendment, which ended prohibition. Many people did not get married, have children, or go to college during this time because of the hardships and the inability to pay for those things. Many often stopped trusting banks. Let me go back. If you know anybody from this time period, you might see how they would save certain items. They maybe hide money around their houses. Many of maybe your grandparents or your great-grandparents, you could ask your parents about this. They would save things that we would normally not think twice about. Napkins, buttons for clothes, zippers, jars and containers, anything that could be repurposed, they often saved. They also hid money. They put money in like coffee cans and put it in the pantry. They might put money in a box and hide it in a closet or under a bed, because they didn't trust banks, and if anything like this was ever to happen again, they would be safe and they'd have a way to take care of themselves. All right, President Hoover encouraged Americans to remain optimistic. However, he would not approve welfare or the direct government support. He believed it was more important for people to rise up themselves and to have more self-respect. He believed individuals and charities could offer most of the relief. Many people did not agree with this and didn't like the fact that the government wasn't playing more of a role. He did ask employers to try not to lay off workers. They did start to offer business incentives to try to keep people employed. Many blamed Hoover, and Democrats took control of the House of Representatives in 1930. All right, Hoovervilles. So shanty towns started being called Hoovervilles because they were blaming him for the growth of this problem. They would use newspapers as Hoover blankets, empty their pockets inside out, representing Hoover flags, meaning that they were poor, unemployed, and/or living in a shanty town. Hoover would not change his policies. So as it continued and things got worse, Hoover started to reconsider. In 1931, Hoover asked Congress to take action. The Federal Home Loan Bank Act was passed, which lowered mortgage rates and allowed farmers to refinance their farms with loans to avoid foreclosure. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was helping businesses try to keep people employed and trying to keep their doors open. Many people criticized that because they felt it was going to big business and not to the people who needed it directly. He believed it would trickle down. So you give money to these big businesses, they keep people working. Those people who are working buy goods from another business, and then that puts money and employees in another place. And it did work eventually. All right, the bonus army. So here we have all these World War I veterans who did their time. They took part in that horrible war that we looked at, and they didn't feel like they were getting what they were promised. So 20,000 World War I veterans arrived in Washington, D.C. with their families. They wanted Congress to honor the Patman Bill. So in 1924, the World War, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. It gave World War I veterans $500 to $1,000 and a life insurance policy for their service. The government had until 1945 to do this. The bonus army wanted it immediately because of the hardships these veterans were facing. They came home, there was a small period of increased wealth and prosperity, and then when this happened, there weren't jobs, they had served their country, and they felt like they at least should get this money from the government to help their families survive. So they marched for several days, and they actually set up shanty towns. Hoover did not agree with them and called them communists and criminals, which we learned about during the causes of the Great Depression and some of the problems that happened. He did give them food and supplies to build a shanty town, or Hooverville, near the Capitol. However, on June 17th, Congress denied their request. Hoover told them they need to leave. 2,000 remained, they were not happy, and they had nowhere to go. So Hoover sent in 1,000 troops to force the veterans to leave. They used gas. An 11-month-old baby died, and an 8-year-old boy was partially blinded. Many were injured, and 2 people were shot. This is a picture of a shantytown burning down. So the use of tear gas, even though it is non-lethal, it is highly flammable. So when this is happening, many of these homes maybe have open fires or candles lit for cooking or being able to see, and any heat source whatsoever, the gas can become flammable. Obviously, these towns are made up of cardboard and wood, so they burned very fast. In the fall of 1932, Hoover lost the presidential election to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. All right, so use this to create your answers for the worksheets and the quizzes. You can pause and rewind this at any time, and may the odds be ever in your favor.